You can go. All right, so we're talking back to the fire. We just saw a couple charts of carbon dioxide and global warming. And so they're somewhat linked. What we know for sure is the CO2 or the carbon dioxide is increased as we burn more fossil fuels. Just want to talk a little bit about, and we're going to talk more about this, and you're going to read about it more in Miller. But since we've seen so many fires, I just wanted to show you a perspective. So here's one of the things about California. Here's what California used to look like 50, 60 years ago. And also lots of Washington that have been burnt. People had 10 acres. Here's a house, here's a cow, here's their 10 acres. I should probably put a line. Let's just say, obviously I'm simplifying this, and there's lots of exceptions, but that's their 10 acres. They had a couple of cows. The cows ate the grass. The grass didn't get into an explosive situation. And they knocked the brush down. The trees, if they had a dead tree, they needed the firewood because that's how they heated their house. So if there was a dead tree, they eliminated it. They cut it up into firewood and or used it for corral post or something. So everybody managed their own land to some degree and for fire. And it was just the way it was. And so, and if you didn't have a cow, you got your neighbor's cows over. And you can see this today if you've ever gone over to Eastern Washington and you're driving and you see areas that aren't grazed much anymore, or there's old fences and now there's no fences. That's because people used to have smaller parcels and keep their fuel load down. And so there was a lot of people living in the country and the fuel load was kept down. Then people started moving to the city, and so a lot of these houses were eliminated, and so people weren't living there anymore, and the fuel loads kind of then went up, because without someone there on their own 10 acres or 50 acres, the trees that needed to be cut down because they were dead didn't get cut down. Grass didn't get grazed, and this has to do with just the fact that we became a more modern society and people weren't willing to live out in the country and make a smaller amount of money. And so this is what happened over time. Go.
Yep.
So this is Mr. Sloan. We've stopped it a couple times, and so on the board. So on the fire video, and so we've talked about how horrific the fire season has been due to various circumstances. We haven't talked about all of those. We talked about private property, small parcels, and how basically 100 years ago, there were cows on all the land in Eastern Washington, and people were cutting trees for timber, firewood. There just wasn't the fuel load. Nowadays, there's a lot more fuel load because those people have moved. I just kind of wanted to make a simple, I hope you can see this, picture of a mountain. This is to represent forest. And forest is complicated. I wish that we could get and study forest in person. I don't know if that's going to happen. We'll see how this year goes. But I drew two pictures of a forest. And this is really complicated. But here's a forest that has lots of trees in it. You can see all these trees I've put in the forest. Lots. And some trees are scraggly and some are pretty good. Lots of scraggle, lots of stuff. And then I put all these brown lines in there. Now look, that brown line, these brown lines, that stands for dead timber, brush, basically fuel load. Well, so we can call this a fuel loaded forest. It's a fuel loaded forest. And then I put another picture over there. And here you see the trees are not so close together. And there's grass growing. And once again, this is a simplification because forestry is complicated. There's as many types of forest as there is types of neighborhoods in Lacey. And but there's some general rules. And I'm going to call this managed forest, or we could call this fuel reduced. We're going to call this fuel reduced forest. So, you know, on the board, that's just a small little couple feet thing. In reality, this is thousands and thousands of acres of California, Oregon, and Washington. And we used to have forests like this, a fuel reduced load forest. Why? Because of some things. Because of natural fires that would come up and burn. Natural fire. Can you see that?
Yeah.
And that reduced the fuel load. We did a lot of grazing. We had a lot of buffaloes. Now I'm kind of just talking all these different reasons. We had not necessarily in any order, but we had buffaloes. That's what grazed buffaloes did. And actually buffaloes destroy everything. If a buffalo goes through a forested range, forest, prairie, there's nothing left but dirt. There's nothing to burn. They don't go through the whole thing, they go through in a zigzag pattern. We did timber harvest. So we were doing some of these things and we kept the fuel load down. So we kept these fuel loads down. Nowadays, in the last 40 years, many of these things have gone away. We put fires out all the time. There's no more natural fire. We're really good at putting out fires. I fought fires. I fought fires, we didn't have helicopters and airplanes. Not many of them anyway. Now we have helicopters and airplanes. We have bulldozers. We're really good at putting fire out. So when you put a fire out, that just stops from burning the fuel load. We don't do as much grazing anymore. We still do, but you don't have this situation where a lot of your fuel has been reduced on a yearly basis. We don't have any buffalo anymore. Timber harvest is being restricted. And also, the thing that would really help is timber thinning. And that's I spent a lot of time thinning timber. We don't do as much of that as we should. As a result, anyway, we have a forest that kind of looks like this. And so that's kind of a little bit of a simplification, but that's kind of what we're dealing with. Not to say that our temperatures aren't creeping up, but remember, we have to talk about, so we had this fire. I'm going to erase this a little bit. Here, why don't you stop. Okay, so we've talked about some of the history of fire or fuel loads in the forest, and that would also be the range. Many of you are not familiar with range, but it's places in eastern Washington where there's not trees, but there's not farms. Most people look out the windows and say it's brush, and it's the same kind of thing. We've stopped the natural fires, we've stopped the grazing, so there's just a lot of fuel load. Over here, let's just talk about August, because that's when we see these huge fires. Maybe July, maybe September, but mostly August. So what I did here, I put a chart here. I don't know if you can see this. Hopefully you can. And it says fuel load. And this is time. It could be years. In this case, it's years. Let's just say it's years. So what happens is your fuel load, it peaks every summer. And then it goes down as it rains. But what happens over time, the fuel load is increasing. So the fuel load increases with these summer peaks. Because I'm a farmer, so so in case you didn't know, we had a very wet May. I have not fed my cattle yet hardly, and some years I start feeding the cattle in August, 1st of August. So we had a lot of rain. So they had a very good summer grazing because we had a lot of May rain. Guess what? It also gave us a big summer fuel load. Because what happens is you get this little spike in fuel loads. then it goes down, but it keeps increasing because your trees are growing, your biomass increases, etc. Anyway, what can cause these August fires? It's kind of 2 or 3 or 4 things altogether besides just an arsonist or lightning. I mean, lightning strike can start it. Someone four-wheeling can start it. As innocent as a campfire. And actually, I guess there was a fire in California this year started by a gender reveal fireworks, if you can believe that. That's terrible, but it's true. I guess it's true. Anyway, in August fires, number one, you have fuel load. It goes up in August. The growth goes up because you get that little bump from rain, from May. And so you get a little higher load then. What else happens? The moisture goes down. Heck, by August, it hasn't rained for 3 months. It didn't rain in June. It didn't rain in July. It did not rain in August. Notice that they don't have big fires like this in Wisconsin and Minnesota because it rains in the summer. Here in the West, it doesn't rain in the summer. So our moisture goes down. Sometimes it gets down to 10% in brush. That is just like, that's newspaper. Winds. We have these climates when we have lots of sun, and with our ocean and with our mountains, we have compression winds. And the winds come down the mountains. Happens in California. It happens in Oregon. It happens here. It happens at my house where I live. I can get up in the morning in August sometimes, and there's a 10-mile-an-hour wind coming right off the mountains, off the Cascades. It's an east wind that day, and I'm always a little hesitant because I know it's very dry. So we have winds. We've had 3 months of summer, and here is the big thing that people don't get about fire. We have fire cyclones. Fire actually will create its own weather. Those of you that have a chimney or a wood stove know that if you leave your flume open, you get fire just roaring. So what happens is that fire actually builds itself. The more you have, the bigger it gets. The bigger it gets, the more you have. It actually will suck in air. Fire builds up. Just like when your fireplace, if you open up your flume, you can just hear that fire roar. If you close your air down, you can't hear it roar. It slows it down. So what happens is this air comes in, bam. Then you have all the rules that you tried to do, all the defensible spaces, and sometimes all the best thing you can do for fuel load doesn't help. But what happens is if you have enough places in your area where the fuel has been reduced, and it's not this, hopefully firefighters can protect life and structures. Because we should really let the forest burn, because that will stop horrific burns in the future and just protect lives and structures. And which is another problem. We put structures where they don't belong sometimes in the middle of forest. But anyway, these fires happen in August for all these things put together. So, a couple things. You can't necessarily say that it's just climate change. You can't necessarily say it's lack of management. You can't say, I mean, there's a combination of things. And one of the biggest factors is that it's August and it's dry out there. And that's when we've always had horrific fires throughout history because of that. Okay, just a little thing on fire as we are trying to do some current events, and maybe we'll have some discussion about this, or if there's any discussion. This is going to be a YouTube video. Okay, I'm Mr. Sloan. Thanks a lot.